So if I ask you what comes to mind when you hear the word selfish, what would you say? Who would you say comes to mind? Because there's some names and faces, don't there, come to mind. Do you come to mind? Probably not. I'm the same way. Probably not with me either. I mean, I don't think of myself when I think of selfish. You probably don't think of you, because it's really hard to look in the mirror and see selfishness in you. And it's really hard to admit you're selfish, because in general, when we think of selfish, we always think of negatives. And when we think of selfish people, we're like, well, I don't want to be known for that. I don't want to be one of those people. And so oftentimes we never see selfishness in ourselves because we don't want to be known for that, and we don't want to be associated with that. Now, this is a conversation for another day, but the dance that we do sometimes, it is kind of difficult. If we were being honest, sometimes we admire selfish people, and the reason we admire them is because of where they've gotten and what they have. And we really want where they've gotten what they have. We just don't want to have to admit you have to be selfish to get there. So we admire the results of their selfishness, and we wish I could get there, but at the same time, I want to get there without anybody viewing me as selfish. So it's this delicate little dance that we go through. And yet the reality is, when I'm not able to acknowledge selfishness in me, or when it's something that's hard to see, well, it may be creating more problems than I want to admit. It may be creating more problems than I really want to see. And the same thing may be true for you. Today is, for those of you who are just joining us, it's part 4 of a series we've been in called Spiritual Growth for Everyday Folks. And when we talk about spiritual growth, we're simply talking about the opportunity every one of us has. There aren't special people and non-special people. There aren't people qualified and disqualified. Everybody can experience spiritual growth. Everybody can experience a relationship with Jesus as becoming more and more personal. That is all spiritual growth is. A relationship with Jesus where you're experiencing him at work in your life and you're knowing him in a way that's more personal than you knew him before. Anytime that happens, you have just experienced spiritual growth. But selfishness sometimes gets in the way of this. So we've been talking about some tools we can put into our lives that will help us to position ourselves best to experience the spiritual growth we all want to experience. And I'll just review real quickly the 5 of them. They are all built around the practical teaching, personal ministry, private disciplines, providential relationships, and pivotal circumstances, all right? Practical teaching, personal ministry, private disciplines, providential relationships, those 4 you have some control over. You can build some habits into your life that help with those. Pivotal circumstances, not so much. Pivotal circumstances are going to come. You don't have much control over them. But if you put the first 4 in your life, you can be prepared for the 5th one. Now, just as a quick aside, it has been driving some of you crazy because we've been talking about these. We've talked about providential relationships and practical teaching, and you're like, Matt, they're not in the right order. I know. That for all you OCD people, this is really hard. But if I put them in the right order, then you'd know what was coming the next week, and you might skip. So I'm just keeping you guessing, okay? We're just bouncing around. But we did create an assessment that would help you. And so if you haven't taken it yet, you can go to our app or you can scan the QR code. It's a really short assessment where you can answer a few questions, and it's going to help you know which of those 5 you are doing best, and which ones you maybe have some opportunities to grow, and it'll give you some customized, personalized suggestions on how to build some habits into your life that God might use to help you grow spiritually. Now, today we're going to focus on this one right here, personal ministry. I want to give you a simple definition of what personal ministry is. It is simply when I invest some of my time, which means time is your life. So when I invest some of my time, I'm really investing part of my life to put somebody else before myself. Whenever you do that, that is personal ministry. And for those of us who are Jesus followers, and if you're not, listen, this may be a good reason. You may be like, I'm glad I'm not, because I don't want to have that expectation. But for those of us who are Jesus followers, it is an expectation we'll do this. And the reason it's an expectation is because we follow a king and a savior, a leader, who did this. I mean, Jesus, when he showed up on this earth, of everybody who's ever lived, you can't argue anybody deserved to be served more than Jesus. But he showed up and said, no, I'm not here to be served, but to serve. I'm here to give my life for other people. And he modeled for us and taught exactly what this looked like over and over and over again. The king, you spend some time thinking about this because it's hard to wrap your head around. The author of life, the king, chose to embrace being a servant. He chose to embrace the nature of a servant. That's what he modeled for us. And then he said to all of us who are followers of his, this is exactly what I want for you. I want you to have my character. Jesus' goal is to develop his character in us while we are here on earth, so that we think the way he thinks, we act the way he acts, we value what he values, we love what he loves, we serve the way he served. That's what spiritual growth is. It's when I'm increasingly believing and behaving more like Jesus. So it is impossible for that to happen in me. It's impossible for me to increasingly believe and behave more like him if I'm not taking on the nature of a servant, because that is exactly what he did. Which is why, for me, maybe for you, I would say this: the greatest obstacle to your spiritual growth may be your personal selfishness. And that's not a criticism. I think it's just a reality for us. Because selfishness is human nature. It is second nature for all of us. We're all probably far more selfish than we recognize or realize. But that may very well be the greatest obstacle to Jesus becoming more personal to you in your life. And a simple way to think about this is, if you think about a time, maybe the last time, that you felt like Jesus wanted you to do something and you didn't follow through and do it. You heard God said, this is how I want you to manage this situation, or you just felt like, I need to take this step, I think God's telling me to do this, and you didn't do it. You had all of these reasons, I'm the same way, all these reasons, all these excuses, all the justification, rationalization for why you didn't do it. But if you dig through all of that and get to the very root, you know why you don't do what Jesus asked you to do? Because you want to do what you want to do, which is the definition of selfishness. I want to do what I want to do. And when what he wants me to do does not line up with what I want to do, I may choose my way over his, which is why personal selfishness is often the biggest obstacle to our spiritual growth. And because it's human nature, you have to train yourself to think differently and to act differently. As a matter of fact, you have to put some habits in your life that Jesus can use to begin to root out the selfishness in you, because none of us really on our own have the power to root that out. None of us on our own have the power to transform or change ourselves to where we think servant first. I'm thinking about you before me, you before me. We can't do that on our own, but we can. We can put some habits, we can put some practices in our life that Jesus says, I will use to change you. I will use to teach you. He had to do this with his own friends. If you know much about Jesus' story, for 3 years, he was in public ministry with his disciples, which were really his best friends. There were 12 of them. And over and over and over again, if you don't believe me, just read any of the biographies of his life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And you will see that in conversation after conversation after conversation, Jesus was trying to teach them why it's so valuable to be a servant and how they should serve others before themselves. And then he was modeling it time after time after time. And Matthew, in his account of Jesus' life, he gives us one of these examples where he explains to us, okay, here's how Jesus was trying to help us understand what it takes to root out the personal selfishness in us so that we could serve people the way Jesus serves us. So here's what Matthew tells us. He says, when Jesus heard what had happened, I need to pause here and tell you what had happened because we're jumping into the middle of this. When Jesus heard what happened refers to Jesus had a cousin named John the Baptist. Some of you have heard of him. Jesus had a cousin named John the Baptist who Jesus heard had just been beheaded, not because he'd done anything wrong. He was beheaded by Herod simply because Herod's wife did not like what John had been teaching and what John had been saying. And so, long story short, they arrest John, they throw him in prison. Herod doesn't want to kill John, he just wants to keep him locked up. But one night, Herod throws this big party. He's got all his buddies over there. Herod's niece comes in. She's the entertainment for the night. She entertains really, really well, so well that Herod looks at her and says, you've been awesome. You just tell me whatever you want, up to half the kingdom, I'll give it to you. It's my way to say thank you for being such great entertainment. And his niece runs out and talks to her mom and comes back in and says, well, I would like the head of John the Baptist served up on a silver platter. You didn't even know that was in the Bible, did you? It is. That's where it came from. Served up on a silver platter. See, some of you should read your Bible. There's some interesting stuff in there. So there's more of the story. I'm not going to tell you now. I'll let you go read it for yourself. So anyway, this is how John the Baptist loses his life. Not because he did anything wrong. Because they were mad at him because they didn't agree with what he was teaching. And when you read the story, you'll see why they were mad at him. And he had a right to be saying what he was saying. But they didn't like it, so they lock him up. And on a whim of a young niece, he gets his head chopped off. And so now Jesus hears, oh man, my cousin has unjustly been killed. And he's doing what any of us would do. He's grieving. He's grieving. So Matthew says, when Jesus heard what had happened. He withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. He's just trying to get away, spend some time processing this. But hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. So maybe these crowds didn't know that John the Baptist had lost his life. Maybe they knew exactly why Jesus was trying to leave and it didn't matter to them. But either way, they see Jesus get in a boat and they start following him around the lake because they've heard about him. They've watched what he's done. They know he serves them in some extraordinary ways, and they got more needs they want to be served. So they're just chasing him down, and as they go around the lake, every town they get to, it's like, hey, we're following Jesus, and then more people come, and it turns into this massive crowd of people. And so Jesus lands on the other side of the lake. He just, it's away from everything. He's trying to get away. And they're surprised to discover this massive crowd. And so Matthew tells us, and Matthew was there, when Jesus landed and he saw a large crowd, I think to the shock of all of Jesus' friends, his disciples, Matthew says Jesus had compassion on them and he healed their sick. Now later in the story, Matthew tells us how big of a crowd this was. There were about 5,000 men plus all the women and children. So you're talking about several thousand people here. And Matthew said, we were astonished because Jesus is gutted over the loss of his cousin, of his friend John. And yet when he sees this crowd, he doesn't look at them and say, hey, I need a little me time. This is a self-care moment, No, he sees their needs and he is filled with compassion. And in spite of the fact he needs some time alone, he spends all day long serving them, caring for them, putting them before himself. But, Matthew says, as evening approached, so he's been doing this all day. As evening approached, the disciples came to him. Now, we don't know what they've been doing all day. Maybe they've been helping with crowd control. It sounds like they hadn't been doing much of anything. They're just watching, and they're exhausted at this point. So the sun's about to set. They come to Jesus. He's been doing this all day long. And here's what they said to him. They simply brought up this. They said, this is a remote place. It's already getting late. Why don't you send these crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food? In other words, this entire crowd is about to need dinner. We do not have the ability to provide dinner. And do you not remember? We all came over here for a little mini vacation. So could you please send the crowd away? We've done our part. Really, you've done your part, Jesus, but it was hard on us too. So we've done our part, Can you just send them off so we can have a little peace and quiet? It's time for them to go. And Jesus looks back at them and shocks them. Because they're thinking, well, yeah, this is the obvious thing to do. I mean, you didn't call catering, did you? There's no way we can feed this many thousands of people. But Jesus looks back at them, and much to their surprise, he says, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. Us? He's like, yeah, you. See, this is the tension we all feel from time to time if you're trying to follow Jesus. It's the tension of, I see a need. These disciples saw a need. This crowd's going to get really hungry. They need some food. But I can't meet the need. Let's just send them off so somebody else can do it. We've all done this. This is part of why we struggle with having a servant's heart. We see a need, and we want the need to get met. But what Jesus does is he often pushes us to the point where he looks at us and says, no. That need and your personal life are about to intersect. Now, what are you going to do? You give them something to eat. Now, here's how it looks in our context. And we have all been guilty of this, okay? We see a need, and you know what we say? I'll pray for you. Because that's really not going to cost us anything, right? We don't even remember to pray half the time, but we say it. It sounds good. I'll pray for you. We see a single mom struggling. I'll pray for you. I'm going to pray that somebody meets that need. And we see kids. I'll pray for them. I'll pray. I'm going to pray God sends somebody to help you with what you're going through. And I think, it's just my opinion, I think God's up in heaven going, you knuckleheads, I've already sent somebody. It's you. You're there, That's why do you think you became aware of the need? Because I want you to step in. We're going, no, but I don't want to step in. Because that will inconvenience me. What I want to do is just pray for them and move on. Or this happens. I know this happens because we're on the receiving end of this. Now, none of you do this. It's all the people who stayed home because of the snow. They're the ones who do this, okay? So we're going to blame them, and I know it's not y'all. But you see a need and you're like, somebody needs to do something to meet that need. And you know what those people, not you, but you know what those people do? They pick up the phone and they call us on staff at church. And they say, and I quote, "Does our church do anything to help with fill in the blank?" And I am really kind. Maybe that's why people quit calling me. Because what I want to say is, you're the church. Are you going to do anything to help with that need? But it's like, no. Because again, I've done the same thing. I'm not being critical. But again, I don't actually want this to intersect with my personal life. I don't want to have to put them before me and meet the need. So what they're really saying, and I'll translate, is, hey, I've seen a legitimate need that needs to be met. Are there some other more generous, selfless people in our church who would step in and do this because I don't want to do it? That's really what they're saying. And yeah, there are a lot of generous, selfless people who make up our church, which is awesome. But I think what God's doing when he lets us see those needs is he's going, how about you be a generous, selfless person who steps in and meets that? And oh, by the way, you may not have enough resources to fully meet it, but how about you go first? And then you let the other generous, selfless people in our church know about it, and they'll come alongside you, and together y'all can get it done. But that's hard, isn't it? I mean, let's be honest. When Jesus puts us in a position where he's trying to make it personal, that's when we get uncomfortable. Because that's when we run right into the personal selfishness rattling around in our hearts. And so we're always like, no, I got a good reason. I got a good excuse why I can't do that. And that's exactly what the disciples did. This is not new. I mean, this is just human nature. It's exactly what they did. They looked back at Jesus when he said, you need to give them something to eat. And their excuse was this, and it sounds like a really good one. We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. I don't know what you expect us to do with that, Jesus. That's all the food we brought with us. We just brought enough to feed ourselves. We got to feed ourselves, you know. So we can't help with this. Now, if you start to become aware of the internal dialogue that happens whenever you see needs or whenever you hear of needs, you are going to discover you are excellent at coming up with reasons why you can't meet the needs that you see. So am I. I can make the best argument in the world for why I don't have enough, I'm too young, I'm too old, I'm not important enough, I'm too important. You can make all the reasons in the world for why. No, I don't have enough knowledge, I don't have enough expertise. You don't know what I've done before. I couldn't help them. I've got my own message. We are so good at rationalizing why we can't be the ones that step in. And Jesus is going, no. I didn't ask you to have it all figured out. I just ask you to make this need personal and to step in and to put somebody before yourself and serve them. So he looks at his friends who are like, well, this one's obvious. He's going to see real quick that we're right. We don't have enough to feed thousands of people here. He looks back at them, and I think much to their surprise, he says, well, just bring those fish and that bread to me. And he directed the people, these thousands of people, to sit down on the grass. Now, I'm reading between the lines, but they'd been with Jesus a while. I think at this point they were cutting their eyes at each other like, uh-oh, he's planning on going through with this. And they're starting to think he's about to drag us into something we really don't want to get in the middle of. We're exhausted. We got busy schedules. We got things to do. We don't have time for this. And this isn't going to end well anyway. How does he think we're going to feed dinner to all these people? But Matthew tells us that Jesus simply took the 5 loaves, the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks, and he broke the loaves, and they were like, uh-oh, we're going to try to feed all these people. And then, Matthew says, he took that little bit of food, and he gave them to the disciples. And let's give the disciples some credit. They had enough trust to turn around and to start feeding the people. Can you imagine the emotion that was going on inside of them? You have been in situations where you were like, I don't want to serve them and get involved in that because I think it's going to turn out really bad. You've not been in a situation worse than this, where they're sitting there with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and there are now thousands of people who've sat down fully expecting a meal, a complete dinner. And you're like, You're not going to hand it out, Jesus? We got to hand it out? And he's like, oh yeah, I want you to hand it out. Turn around and get started. See how long that lasts. And I may be wrong. I think in their head, they're picturing a scene similar to if you have a teenager, you know what happens when you feed them dinner and they devour the entire table and they're like, I'm still hungry. And you're like, well, we're out of food. And then it's like, I'm not going to live till the next morning. And they just erupt, you know. I kind of feel like that was probably similar, only multiplied by thousands. They're like, this is going to turn into a riot. We're going to get the first 2 circles of people up here fed, and then everybody else is going to say, where's ours? This is going to get ugly quickly. And they're going to blame us. They're not going to blame Jesus. We're the ones who are out here handing out food. Can you imagine how unreasonable, irrational it must have been? Can you imagine how much insecurity and fear they must have felt stepping in and starting to hand this out? But Jesus asked them to do that because he wanted them to learn something. The same thing that I think he wants all of us to learn. It's why he invites us into opportunities where we see a need and he says, I want you to go meet it even if you don't feel like you can and even if you don't want to. He's trying to help us learn this, that you do what you can do and then you can trust Jesus to do what only he can do. And as we have said throughout this entire series, when your trust in Jesus grows, guess what happens? He becomes more personal to you. That's how it works in every relationship in your life. The more trust there is between you and a person, the more personal the relationship becomes. It's no different with Jesus. And so he looks at him that day, and he's like, I know you don't know how this is going to turn out, and you think it's going to be a disaster. I know you don't feel like doing it, and you don't want to do it. I'm telling you, take this little bit of food, turn around, stop making excuses. Just bring me what you have. Bring me what little money you have. Bring me what little resources you have. Bring me what little experience you have. Bring me what little time you have. I don't care if you feel like doing it or not. Just, you can have a bad attitude. You still got to show up and bring it. With a bad attitude, you just do what you can do. And then watch what I do with it. That's what the disciples did that day. And much to their surprise, Matthew tells us that the crowd, they all ate, they all were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 baskets full of broken pieces that were left over. It was a miracle. Now, if you have a hard time wrapping your head around how that miracle could happen, that's fine. That's a story for another day. But here's what I don't want you to miss. There were thousands of people sitting on the grass waiting to be fed that day. And they had a great dinner. But you know what? Best we can tell, while they got to enjoy the benefits of the miracle, they didn't even know a miracle had happened. They had no idea that Jesus only had 5 loaves of bread, or 5 fish and a couple loaves of bread. They had no idea the food was that limited. They just enjoyed the benefits of a great meal. They got to receive the blessing, so to speak. They enjoyed the miracle. But you know who got to participate in the miracle? The disciples, who were willing to trust Jesus enough to turn around and start handing it out, who were willing to put somebody else before themselves, even when it didn't make sense to them. Every single day, you and I get to make that choice. And I think part of the reason that we don't grow more spiritually and God's not more personal to us in our lives is not because he's not trying to be. It's because we have settled for sitting and enjoying the benefits of other people choosing to serve as God asks them to serve, and we receive the blessing from it. But we never participate in it. And so our lives feel good to us, but we're missing what God's doing all around us. Because we're spectators, not participators. Because we're consumers. We just enjoy the meal. We haven't chosen to be contributors. But God's always inviting you and giving you an opportunity to step out of the crowd and to be part of the group that puts somebody else before yourself. But that's not easy. It's not easy to wake up every morning and to have a mindset of, all right, who can I serve today? I'm looking for opportunities to put somebody else before me. Who am I going to run into today that needs some encouragement and I can give it to them? that needs me to put myself on the back burner so that they can do what they need to do. I'm ready to do that. It's hard to wake up every day and look for other opportunities to put somebody else before yourself. But that is what Jesus followers do, because that is what our King did and continues to do. This is why, by the way, we invite you quite often around here, if you're not serving here, to get involved serving. Serving here on Sundays at church, it's like a starter step, okay? It's like a starter habit. I don't have any illusions. We've been doing this a long time. I've been doing this a long time. I know serving for an hour on Sunday is not going to root all the personal selfishness out of my life, but it's a first step towards it. Because when you choose to show up and give an hour of your time, or a little bit of your time, and you're like, I'm here to put somebody else before me and to think of somebody else before myself, that starts moving you in the right direction to the point that you can eventually wake up every morning and do that. And Jesus has the ability then to take the time that you are investing in putting somebody before yourself and use it to root out the personal selfishness that's in your heart, just like it's in mine. And a lot of you know this. We've got over 350 of you who volunteer here regularly, every single month. You're active volunteers. And you get this. You've experienced this. You've experienced what it's like to be one of the disciples. Because everybody else comes, you kind of sit in seats, and you're like the crowd. You just take whatever's coming. You're like, oh, that was great. I love it. What you don't know is there are people on the other side of this, all the volunteers here, who are going, oh my gosh. They're hearing the stories. They're like, I can't believe God's using me and God's using us to do that in their life, and to do that in their life, and to do that in their life. They're participating in the miracles. They're not just enjoying the benefits of it. And that is a catalyst for their spiritual growth. That's why I invite you to serve. That's why I invite you to get involved, because we all need some starter habits that help train us, that God can use to teach us how to be a servant, like our King and our leader serves us. So, if you're not involved here, the next step for you, I hope, is going to be to come to one of our Serve Now events. We do these a couple times a month. You can go to the app, QR code, and you can get all the info. The thing about this is such a safe step because it's no obligation. When you go to Serve Now, you basically see and hear about the volunteer opportunities that are around here, but you can walk out and not do anything if you want to. And I don't even call you if you say no. So there, we're kind about it, all right? You can just go check it out. But that's how, my question to you would be, how are you ever going to root out the personal selfishness that is creating issues in your life that maybe you can't even see? Unless you develop some habits, unless you start somewhere serving. The reason I invite you to do this so often is because this is what's best for you. This is what I want for you. I'm not doing it because it's best for our church. I'm not doing it because, man, everything's going to fall apart if we don't get some more volunteers. No, contrary to what many of you think, we don't have enough. We still have plenty of holes. And so I could tell you about what we do to serve special needs kids and special needs families, and I could tell you about, hey, we're looking for some one-on-one buddies right now to help them on that side of the building. And some of you would love that. You'd find so much joy and purpose in that. I could talk about all the opportunities to invest in the lives of kids and students and large group host over there. And some of you are great at communicating. You'd love that part. I could talk to you about, hey, we're looking for food prep people at high school on Sunday nights, and you'd love doing that. I mean, we could talk about all the things. You'll hear about all that at Serve Now. But I'm not inviting you to serve because it's like, oh my gosh, we just need to fill a hole and get people to do a task. No, that's not the point. The point is, the greatest obstacle to your spiritual growth is probably your personal selfishness. I know it is for me. And it is so normal in our culture. It's just human nature to have selfishness. It's so normal that it's hard to even spot it in ourselves. Because you're like, well, I'm just no different than anybody else. But it is hindering your ability to know Jesus in a way that is more personal. And what he is saying is, I don't want to hear all the excuses. You just take whatever excuse you have. I'm too busy, I'm this, I'm that. You just take whatever excuse you have and you bring it to me. You do what you can do. You see a need, you get involved. You don't pass it off and pray about it or ask somebody else to do it. You let that need intersect with your personal life in a way that may make you uncomfortable and may be inconvenient for you. but you do what you can do. And trust me to do with what you bring what only I can do. And when you do that, I have watched this happen my entire life. When you do that, something extraordinary happens because you learn Jesus is trustworthy in a way you never knew before. And he becomes more personal to you. Serving. Serving is what roots out personal selfishness from our hearts. Sitting in rows, listening to somebody like me speak and being like, oh, that was wonderful and that was encouraging, and then you're out the door. Sitting in rows, if that's all you're going to do, it just reinforces personal selfishness. Sitting in rows, just listening to me, and that's all you ever do, it just makes you a consumer. You don't want to be a consumer. Consumers don't end up full of joy. Consumers don't end up with a relationship with Jesus that feels so personal. You don't want to just benefit from the miracle. You want to participate in it. That's how you grow. So, for those of you who serve here, thank you. You are extraordinary. And it is so fun to watch God working through you. And for those of you who aren't, maybe it's a starter habit you need to put in place. Not so you can check a box and say, well, I did that, but so you can begin to learn what it's like to take your time and your life and invest it in someone else before yourself. To take your time and your life and say, okay, I'm going to do what I can do, Jesus, and I'm going to see what you do with it. You'll be amazed at what he does through you. But you'll be more amazed at what he does in you. Because personal ministry is always a catalyst for growth spiritually. Let me pray for us. Father, it's so hard to see the personal selfishness inside of ourselves. So maybe this week for a lot of us, the next step is just, would you make us aware? When we see these needs and we start doing all the internal justification for why we can't meet them and why we shouldn't step in, and we got all the excuses, just help us to realize, no, let's dig through all that. I just want to do what I want to do. I don't want to put somebody else before myself. Help us to be aware of it. And then for those of us who follow you, goodness, it's impossible to follow you well and not serve, not prioritize others before self, because that's exactly what you have done for us. That's exactly who you are, Jesus. So help us to take a step, whether it's to get involved here, whether it's to figure out a different way to get involved. Help us to take a step to begin to practice thinking of others before ourselves, so that eventually you can transform our hearts to where being a servant is not something we do from time to time. It's just who we are. It's just how we now think. And Jesus, most of all, thank you for showing up not to be served, even though that's what you deserved. Thank you for showing up to serve us and to give your life on a cross for our behalf. Thank you for being our Savior and offering us forgiveness. Thank you for being our King and offering us freedom from the selfishness we just can't escape on our own. It's in your name we pray. Amen.